Here she is. Hello.
Hello.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
So we've just started tasting, but we hi, it's me by the way. And what we wanted to know is, obviously you've both been making wine there for a certain period of time, a long period of time. So when you're constructing the wines, what do you put into them that gives them?
Put this on mute, because otherwise you're going to hear it twice.
I can hear two of me, which I realise is probably
a wealth of richness, but you know, wine from kind of more people drinking. But what is it about wine that you think therefore, hey, this is the wine that will develop and bottle? What is it that gives you that extra something? Either of you.
Just to clarify, we have extremely difficulties to understand you what you're saying, including a question. And I wonder if somebody's able to sort out the techno problems.
Try. Although let's say what the Siberian uses, which is hang on again. Oh, can you talk into the phone and then we can pass the phone around? Yeah.
Hello?
Right.
Oh, this is spooky, isn't it?
Hello.
It's like something that's puppeteer. So we would just, what makes a wine when you're constructing? What's changed between you starting making wine in Central and now, when you come to look for the wines that you think, hey, look, this is something I think will develop and bottle, not just something which will be lovely in the shorter term, but what is it that you both look for?
Oh, it turns out I'm starting.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think it's a sort of evolution on multiple fronts from vine age and also winemaker age possibly as well. When I first got to Central Otago, there are a lot more young vines than there are now, and certainly we had loads of young vines. And so you tended to get these wines without necessarily doing anything, but had, you know, big fruit, but maybe weren't as structured. And so I remember early on people would talk about how we needed to bring structure to those wines, and so maybe with a bit more extraction and things like that, to try and give them a bit more sort of depth and stuffing on top of that kind of Central Otago fruit, which was a byproduct of young vines and also some warm vintages around that period. And then just as things moved on, you found that the wines actually, you know, had more structure and depth to them and weren't showing you everything that they had right from the word go. And so you could see, you know, even quite early on in ferment that the wines were definitely going to benefit from longer aging, maybe, you know, longer in barrel as well, before sort of showing their true colors.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I hope you're okay. We still got some rain, which is good. Keeps us out of mischief. And coming back, I just want to go a couple of steps backwards. When we first, when the first Pinots came out in our region around, from 87 onwards, we had no idea how well the wines will be aging in the first place. You still can actually enjoy, like a 1990 ribbon, and so it goes also for Jard Farm. And the main reason is because we didn't know what to expect coming in this region, because effectively we have no history. You're part of being on our history journey with us. And I guess in part of the tasting you're tasting now at the moment, you will see some wines with obviously with some age on it, and you can see how they develop. At the time, we didn't know how they will develop. What surprised us the most is the actual fact that developed so nicely. And this is now the key factors coming in, is that I think the foundation is that we started off our region almost immediately with professionals. Proper viticulturists, proper winemaker who understand, and also more importantly, had a worldly understanding to understand the love of Pinot, and that didn't have an ego-driven, this is my way. They realized that my way is actually also our way. And I think this is very much reflected in our Pinots. And then, of course, coming back, what obviously Paul was saying, it all ties in. But ultimately, what surprises us the most is we started off with a relatively high platform in regards to Pinot quality. So if we want to go back now to the early vintages, and I use the description from Nick Mills, and he says, like in the early days when we started off, it's like children, and we made this beautiful crayon drawings, you know, they're nice and colorful, engaging, like fruit dominant and really pleasing, and bit just super, you know, fruit intensity of the clarity and purity of Pinot. And now with age, we're now starting to use oil color, so more defined, and actual fact, oil itself gives you more texture. And this is why the wines are now starting to, I guess, immediately, I would say they have a more a character profile, which is more expressive.
Yep, sounds good. And just tell us, are you all trying the wines from sort of oldest to youngest? Is that the story?
Yeah, we did it that way around. So we've just done the Wooing Tree 06 and the Amersfield 08. And
Oh, yeah, nice.
The Domain Road 09.
Oh, yeah. Well, just quickly then ties in with what Rudy was saying. So the Wooing Tree 06, that's their first full vintage, really. I think they had a small harvest in 05, and then 06 was the first sort of full crop. And so here you really are dealing with a wine that's been made from, you know, as younger vines as you can make wine out of, really, and on the quite sort of sandy light soils of Wooing Tree, just opposite the famous Big Fruit sculpture in Cromwell. And so an interesting wine, and I'm sad that we don't have it in front of us, to look at what, when it was young, was a very fruit forward, ripe, plush wine, and seeing how that ages, you know, I said from young vines.
The Amersfield 2008 is from Pisa. It's also part of one of the earlier vintages. 2008 was a rather good vintage, very good weather conditions. And if you got the yields right, you got a very, very concentrated wine. And actual fact, I guess the Rocanol that's is possibly quite structural for Amersfield, but also when you taste some younger Amersfields, you will see the structure now has a much finer form. Again, if you follow through the wine's our own evolution, as you know, as being the custodians of the land.
And probably as a pair, just on vintages, 2006 and 2008, probably the warmest vintages of the whole lineup. And particularly in 06, the very first wine, we had an unusual weather event last weekend of January, where we had 3 days in a row over 40 degrees. And there were some issues in the region with sunburn on vines that, like young vines, that might have a lighter canopy. So that was sort of a notable and quite an early harvest. And Wooing Tree is an early site as well. And 08, similarly quite warm without the heat waves, potentially high yields, but also a warmer harvest. And then through the rest of them, the two other warmer years, not quite as warm as those two, 2012 and 2015, both quite even warm vintages. And the coolest would be sort of 09 and then behind that 11.
So obviously this is going to be something that is going to become more front of mind, the kind of changing climate. So do you see that going forward you'll have to spend, how are you going to combat it? Is it going to be in the vineyard, is it in the winery, or is it both? Because obviously you must have one eye on the fact that these weather events are not necessarily becoming warmer, but they are becoming more extreme, aren't they?
Yes, and also Jane, take into account, we will expecting potentially more rainfall during the ripening period. So that means also that the danger of maybe having a far too early botrytis infection. So from a viticulture point of view, the interesting part is that on one side, we want to make sure, and that is just, if it gets too technical, please let me know. But just imagine a grapevine, you got all the leaves covering the bunches, that we need to make sure that we got even a more open canopy than normal. And now is the conundrum, at the same time, you want to protect the bunches from, from the direct sun because of direct events. So they're not getting, the skins and not getting, so to speak, damaged. At the same time, you want to make sure that the bunches are exposed because you want that the bunches dry out very quickly after warm rainfall. So coming back to the answer is effectively constant. I think we spend more and more time in the vineyard to make more fine tuning, that we do the right part, when to leaf pluck and maybe when not to leaf pluck. And also the more important part also will be to absolutely have to make sure that the bunches in their own right are loose and not literally speaking punched up. So we don't want to have a car pile up. We actually, in fact, we want enough distance from one car to another that there's enough room for the bunch to be achieve optimal ripeness, but also be protected from botrytis infection or powder infection, because you also keep in mind that we're all pretty much very more and more focused from an organic point of view. So that means we cannot use any systemic fungicides, which we're not using any of us, from our point of view anyway. But so there's a couple of factors coming together, but bottom line is more and more observation in the vineyard.
Yeah, and just to sort of add to that, I think it's worth noting that in Central Otago, climate change for us doesn't mean the same thing as, say, climate change would in the Riverlands or in the Barossa, where, you've got to recall that we are extremely far south and in a marginal cool climate. So there's a long way to go overall before we're sort of too hot for Pinot, if you like. But what we are suffering from is more and more extremes of weather. And so, snowfalls in summer, late frosts. We had a frost 5 years ago on the 4th of January, so in the middle of summer. So a lot more extreme weather events. And as Rudy was saying, it means that in the vineyard, you've got to be just absolutely onto it in terms of responding with best practice to the sort of slings and arrows of extreme weather events much more often, whether it's wind, rain, snow, frost, you name it. And so although our picking dates, say at our sites, have moved forward a little bit while I've been here, what we've noticed more than anything is extremes. And they're not all warmer vintages. So in 2017, for example, our vineyard didn't clear 800 growing degree days for the season. We still got the grapes right, but that's the cool end of the cool end. So it's not a sort of linear sort of progression where we're all going to be growing Syrah in 5 years.
I think another big impact will be, Jane and everybody else, is that we're spending more and more time now understanding cover crops, because also they play a role of the diversity within your vineyard, and the more diversity you have, there's a better chance that indirectly you obviously attract more insects, which always has a positive impact in regards to any form of fungal infection. And also our main point is also try to make sure that we have a better water holding capacity within the soils as well. So that also plays in. And I guess Paul will correct me, is that if we can get this well sorted, so if there's a massive rain event, let's say you got 50 mils in an hour, there's a much better chance for the vineyard to handle this impact of the high impact of water coming through the system, so it doesn't actually affect it. It can be absorbed and it doesn't run off.
And as a region, you have the most organic vineyards, don't you? You're within New Zealand.
Yeah, I think the regions are
higher than anyone else.
Yeah, we're sitting on 25% at this stage, and the New Zealand average, I think, is 8.
Yeah. Okay. And so once you get the grapes into the winery, because I had a look at some of the technical sheets, some are hilariously detailed with more than you could ever possibly want to know about the wine, and some are slightly lighter, shall we say. But things like stem inclusion or, you know, final alcohols or something like that, are you trying to worry about that, or are you just seeing what will be kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it depends on our seasons, what the challenges are you run into. Like some years you're just trying to get it right, other years you're trying to pick it before your potential alcohol gets too high. So it's quite seasonal. I think, you know, universally across the region, people are conscious of avoiding, you know, high alcohol in Pinot. I think we probably all agree it doesn't carry the aromas or, you know, flavors of Pinot particularly well when they get spirity. So that people are picking earlier. And I think part of that is also confidence and experience, you know, in a young region, you know, whether it's Central or in Oregon where I'd worked, there's a tendency as people are still coming to grips with an area to pick on the late side because everyone's terrified of making sort of green or vegetal unripe Pinots. And as they get more experience with their sites, you see those picking dates come back as people get confident with their site and sort of build that relationship with the vineyard.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think the key is also, Jane, is that I think from a winery point of view, we know now what actually is working for fruit. And for example, just going back to a little bit of the phases of Pinot Noir making in the early days, it was really important that you have to use, not really important, it was the trend to have very heavily toasted oak. You know, it's like you basically have a beautiful toast with bacon on it. So that was a part of a great Pinot Noir aromatics. Another one was Acad, which basically you look for a high additions before harvest, so you get lots of what do we call it, excessive extractions. And then we had the phase of whole bunches, which is interesting because it went from one pendulum to the other. Now, of course, it's the whole point is, you know, with less punch downs, the better. And then it's also the other part is, you know, the earlier you pick, the better. So as a region, we still try to find our own individual balance of each site. And I think that is really, really beautiful to see. And I think I would say particularly of the later vintages, I guess, would that be fair to say from 15 onwards, you see more definition of each, you know, quality producer of our region. You know, I mean, it will be interesting what would be your take? Did you pick up a difference a certain year that you felt suddenly Central Otago Pinot is actually fact really starting to almost seriously grow up? Is that a good question?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, but I think that also depends on what you were looking for in Central Otago Pinot, because I'm sure there are still people who enjoy, and they're still being made, those kind of richer styles. And, you know, they kind of still like that kind of oakiness and the richness and the voluptuousness that some people are still chasing. And I think that it's probably a more, if you're a customer and you're used to that, and then you're suddenly presented with what we as wine people would think are kind of, in inverted commas, better wines, when you see that kind of more expression or more sensitive oak or lighter colors or whatever, I think that's maybe the kind of transition between one and the other is much more. I think the consumer is still coming along behind, if you know what I mean. They still think of them as being those kind of richer wines. Maybe, I don't know. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've just had the domain. So to go back, because I'm keen that everyone gets their own. We don't miss anybody out. So you had the Domain Road, which would have come from fruit in Bannockburn. Is that off Felton Road still? Yeah.
So so just to recap, because I was just conscious we didn't talk about that vintage either.
Sorry.
So going from the sort of more sandy soils of Wivingtree and Cromwell to the sort of glacial and alluvial soils of Pisa with the Amersfield, from 2 warm vintages, and then 09 from Domain Road is quite a different season and a pretty unique one, really. Having come off a warm vintage, 09 felt like it was sort of going to be another pretty favorable sort of easy-ish vintage. And that was sort of all well and good until the month of February, where it was basically like winter for the whole month. So February's often our warmest month of the growing season. And in 09, it was quite remarkable. We had a bunch of snowfall events in the hills. We had rain, and I know at our place, which is a bit higher than Domain Road, but you know, our average temperature through the month of February was only about 14 degrees. So it was basically like winter. So such an unusual growing season, because it's like pretty much normal, except with 1 month just removed from the growing season with basically no growing degree days at all. And it made for, that's also one of the sort of key periods, if you like, where the grapes are getting their suntan. And so at least for us, I think generally across the region, the wines were a little lighter, just because of that very cold and cloudy February. But it belied the fact that there was not a high yielding year. So there's a lot of concentration there and structure, and the wines have actually held up really well. And I guess also, kind of proof that, you know, chasing colour and Pinot Noir is kind of irrelevant.
It looks really lovely. It's very, very pretty, very lifted floral style. And then next, what you've got the Georgetown one, which is down on our list as Nocky's Palette, which is a slightly strange name for one, but anyway. Oh, it's a single vineyard. Okay, so that's not the one as you drive into Cromwell, is it, on the right hand side, that kind of low-lying one against the road? Yeah,
exactly. So that's one of the 3 vineyards that were planted by Gary Andrus, the founder of Archery Summit in Oregon.
Oh, wow.
And after he parted ways with Archery Summit, he started his own label called Gypsy Dancer, both in Oregon and in Central Otago. And so he came in and planted, it's just 3 sites, isn't it, Rudy? The same as he'd done with the Arcus Vineyard at Archery Summit up on the Dundee Hills. So close planting, metre by metre, I think, and, you know, with the specialised gear, and so pretty much got them up and running, and then the wheels fell off. You know, sort of burning it in 2 hemispheres, and the 3 vineyards went in different directions. So Georgetown, which was E&D, and now new owners, Nocky's Palette, went one way. The Bannockburn Vineyard went to Desert Heart initially, and is now part of Terra Sancta. And the Gibbston Valley one went to Gibbston Valley. So that's sort of the history there. And Gary sort of sadly passed away a few years ago. But that's the origin. So quite a different setup to what we'd seen in Central Otago up to that point. It's a pretty warm site, and is sort of one of the earlier ones in the valley. Despite being flat, it gets a lot of airflow out of the gorge and seems to be pretty much frost-free, quite fertile. And I'm not sure, Rudy, do you remember where Ian was making the wines in 11?
No, unfortunately, I wouldn't know, but possibly at Vinpro, with possibly a safe guess.
Yeah, I think so.
And the interesting one, another one is, you know, Te Wahi. This is the first official release of Cloudy Bay out of the Northburn Vineyard, and also in conjunction with the vineyard they have got now in Bannockburn, and also from a small vineyard, Tosk, in Pisa. So this is a link of 3 different vineyards, which is almost like a regional expression of 2011 for Cloudy Bay. I guess, you know, Te Wahi means that the place.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's the only regional blend in the lineup, and so interesting to compare it to single sites through the rest of the lineup and Georgetown from the same vintage.
Yeah. I mean, 2011 was an interesting vintage for us. It was I call it, I use the term a relatively lean vintage, which means is that the wine itself hasn't got a lot of fat, so to speak, to cover up its own imperfection. We love those wines because those wines are possibly the most expressive and honest wines in the whole lineup because of a cool vintage. But at least you then learn to appreciate the vulnerability of Pinot Noir and how it ages. And then the Pinot Noir takes on the attitude and says, look, I know I got a crooked nose and one tooth missing, but I don't care. I am what I am, and if whatever you like, I don't mind, but I'm very proud of myself. So that's 11, and I think this is very important to learn from those wines because we certainly learn a lot of them.
And 11 was definitely a vintage for the viticulturalists, a very unstable growing season, to the point where, depending on what time of the year you were talking about, it was either too hot, which it was quite early, too wet as it was coming into Christmas, too windy, or too dry, and so quite unstable all the way through. And found that, at least for us, it was like the grapes and then the wines carried this souvenir of having a bit of a rough childhood. There's always a lot of structure to them, and although when they were young, they're a little overshadowed by the vintages either side that were a lot more generous. I always thought it was a vintage that was sort of wind down the track, and that seems to have been the case, especially for ours. That's the vintage that's really coming to its own now, but potentially also high yielding, so yield management was also important.
It's definitely still got quite impressive tannins, even 10 years on. I wouldn't say it's a I'll be back from that one, sorry. I find it a bit kind of like almost not forced, but quite I don't know.
Which one are you talking about? The Cloudy Bay?
That's just, to me, it's just like 10 years on, it's kind of got older, but it hasn't really developed into anything. It's just kind of like old and structured, as opposed to
I think it's fair to say is that from a Cloudy Bay point of view, and it's also fair to say this wine is made in Marlborough, so they haven't really got around it, but certainly not around, after all, this is the first vintage released. They haven't really got around it yet to fully understand the site, and also not being close to the site. And of course, that all has changed now dramatically because they got a very good viticulture team in place, and the winemakers come down regularly and so on. But I guess if you want to follow the journey of of an outside company, being basically having their new home in Central, like Cloudy Bay, it's very important to follow through these wines, and you see a really quick learning curve. We have gone through this learning curve already, so hence it's a big difference. But also take into account, even if you got all the knowledge or got everything else available in funds and but it's the site who basically you need to focus in order to achieve what you need to achieve. And we got the advantage because we are on site. And I guess to be an absentee vineyard owner or absentee vineyard winemaker, that's maybe a better description. There's always a gap between, and this gap is getting smaller, smaller, and smaller because there are better people and more people on the ground. Just please keep this in mind. And I think Jane, you definitely can see that the influence of the philosophy of the winemaker or even Cloudy Bay and what actually fact is in the glass, they're not matching up right now.
Right. Okay.
But that's a good learning curve again to understand because there's many reasons for that. Thank you.
So we're now on your Quartz Reef 2012.
So that's on a as you already know, it's on a north-facing slope and so on. So the vines have now, they are within 14, 15 years old. And I think this is, for me, 2012 is for me a vintage, not only just for us, but also for the region, where you see the first signs becoming of age. And I think 2012 reflects that one, where you're now getting better and finer tannins, and the wines are not anymore as muscular as they used to have been from Quartz Reef. And I'm very fond of, personally very fond of 12. It's interesting, what we're tasting it now is that you still, again, interesting enough is that even then, you know, I get this really nice, slightly mushroomy, toasty aromatics coming on the wine. And then on the palate is relatively, you know, it's got nice structure, but it's edge effect in a nice balance. And I think that is for me the link of wine age having also more experience and be more confident in the growing and in the following the wine through in the stage to the bottle. You know, what's your take on?
I think worth mentioning the season a little bit too, because such a contrast in Central Otago versus the rest of New Zealand. It was a vintage that was really challenging if you were further north. We had a lot of sort of tropical cyclone type rain events coming through New Zealand and quite wet vintages in Hawke's Bay and in Marlborough. But we were protected from all that weather. So for us, compared to more traumatizing vintages like 09 and 11, where there was a lot of tricky weather, 2012, if you could call it that, was sort of one of the easy ones where it was a really nice, even growing season. The summer was beautiful. You know, my kids at the time were swimming in the lake, but at the end of October, which almost never happens if you don't want to die. And so a very warm, stable season without the sort of peaks and troughs of some of the other ones. And yeah, so led regionally to these you know, voluptuous, very generous wines. And yeah, such a contrast. So it was a vintage where, you know, traveling overseas for us was always, you always felt like you were defending it because people had written off New Zealand for 2012. And I guess it sort of shows, you know, what a diverse country we are in terms of climate and weather, where it's really dangerous to sort of have one view of a vintage out of the country.
Yeah, that is very true. People forget that New Zealand is, you know, the growing grapes is a distance of 1,800 kilometers. It's like if you compare vintage. You know, the same vintage in Austria is quite different to the same vintage in south of Spain. So that also it's quite important for us. We take this into account, that there are dramatic differences between the regions. But then again, you got years like 2019, which are universally beautiful in New Zealand.
It was probably the first one, in my opinion. I don't know if everyone else can chip in, but I don't think it's reached its optimum drinking window yet. I mean, it's very pretty now, but it seems as though it's still got more to give. So looks really smart, really smart. And we apparently now got the next one is the barley, which of course, I'm going to just step in. If you can't get the staff, I realise that obviously Auckland hospitality is.
I would just like to point out how white the tablecloths are. I haven't worked on the floor for a long time.
So now we've got the barley. Is it 15 as well?
I know this one.
13.
13, is it?
Yeah, 13. Sorry, yeah, Gibston. 13.
Yeah, so cool that you're getting a range of single vineyard wines from around the subregions. So great to be over in Gibston. And the 13 vintage was on the whole a sort of a favourable one where people attained ripeness at the end of the season fairly well, but it had a very cool spring. And notably, there was a really brutal frost. Was that in the 20th of November, something like that, end of November, where basically it snowed to ground level to the side of the highways on a Friday night. And that was fine because it was busy snowing. But then Saturday, the weather cleared out and you had this beautiful blue sky day. and the snow only melted about halfway up the hills. And so that Saturday night, you had just a mega frost in the Cromwell Basin, and Gippsland is sort of all over. So big impact on yields for the region. Some vineyards that were, totally wiped out. And so a very cool start. But the season came right, sort of coming in from about mid-December. It really warmed up coming into Christmas, and the rest of the summer was actually okay. So coming through into the autumn period where there wasn't really much weather, there's only sort of one decent rain in April. Most people were able to get over the finish line quite easily, but quite low yields. You can expect from that vintage quite a bit of concentration. The berries were small, and there's a risk as well if you went sort of too hard in the winery of making quite tannic wines in 13. But a vintage, I think, that's just sort of coming into its own now, finally.
Yeah, that's definitely a vintage you have to wait. And we see it within our wines as well, that the 13s are now the really nice to drink. But interesting enough, you still need to decanter them. This is also interesting notes. And not to mention, of course, that Grant has a very good understanding about Gippsland. He's, he got his own vineyard there. And he still manages to have some beautiful expressions out of Gippsland, what Gippsland really can show. And also coming back to the evolution of our vineyards and the region, is that you're getting far more consistency out now of Gippsland than ever before. And again, this is also a very, very good a good sign. You could say this is also maybe something to do with climate change as well, but ultimately it does come back to better understanding of the vineyard, in actual fact, to understand your fruit better.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when I arrived in Central Otago in 2005, there was still an idea that, Gippsland would have a difficult vintage 2 out of 5, or, the wines, people would struggle to get the grapes over the line. But I think those days are sort of long gone, and it's particularly down to the viticulture where, as with the rest of the region, you've got to be onto it. But in Gippsland, the margins are really fine. If you overcrop, then, you risk not getting it right. And in the cooler sites, you'll always be picking at the later end of the season, in sort of late April or early May anyway. And so the margins are that much finer. But what we've seen, over the last 10 years is just incredibly consistent wines out of Gippsland, more and more. And, it's an absolute reliable region. And so, yeah, don't believe the early hype or in terms of being too cold.
So now we're on the Misha's. Or is
15.
15. So we've got Misha's Vineyard. 15 at last now.
So you got here 2 wines now coming out of Bendigo. One is on the facing, the face effectively west facing, on an elevation of 300 meters. No, basically
the very top of it's 300.
Yeah, from 220 to 300 meters on a very steep slope. And then you got yours, which is north facing, and 350 or thereabouts.
320 to 400.
Yeah. And yours will be possibly 3-4 years older in the vine age.
Yeah, for sure. So on Misha's, so you're Lakefront Terrace, so you're sort of halfway up Lake Dunstan between Cromwell and the end of the lake, heading towards Terrace. Quite a steep site, and there the soils are completely schist based, so very, very rocky. And depending on where you are in the site, there's varying amounts of loam and topsoil, but the underlying material is the parent material of Central Otago. You're on straight schist rock. that area wasn't really farmed in any sort of consistent way. And although the soils are very low vigor, they have very high mineral content. The key thing that it's lacking in, of course, is organic matter. So it's not the land of kind of monster vines. And a consistently warm site. It's frost-free as far as you can be in Central Otago because of the steep sort of air drainage to the lake. And the wine's made by Ollie Masters at Maud, and hopefully you've got some info in the tip notes there about how that was made. Their notes are normally pretty good.
We're sending everyone, we're being PC, so we're not giving everyone 12 sheets of paper.
Oh yeah, nice.
We're going to compress them, and then with our amazing technical skills, try and
Yeah.
send the file to everyone afterwards, but that's okay. Put a couple of days aside for that later. So.
Oh no, good. Yeah, we don't see Ollie quite as much as some of the other winemakers, so we're not kind of quite as au fait with how he rolls in the winery.
Okay. And then last one, which was a slight panic, but we did manage to phone to Corkscrew because yours is the only one Holland to DM. So we were like, everyone's slapping their thighs and looking for a corkscrew. But talk to us about your wine.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess, yeah, a bit old school on the closure as with the old school winemaker as well. So I guess maybe kick off with the season on both of them. 2015 was a little mixed sort of through the spring, but actually had quite notably had a very warm finish. You had some summer-like temperatures through March that brought the ripening along quite quickly at the end, and we ended up picking in early April with some pretty warm temperatures during harvest that we're maybe not used to, where the days in autumn were still getting up into the mid-20s. So quite a solar vintage, lots of sun. And so that one, the cuvee, is from our home vineyard. So you're still in Bendigo, but you're a little further north, higher elevation on a north-facing slope, as already mentioned. And the soil up there, it's a different, formed by a glacier 650,000 years ago. So the schist is weathered to a much greater degree. And so it's formed clay. It's basically been ground down to its finest particles and released all the calcium inside it. So you've had the formation of sort of clay and chalk soil, pedogenic lime. So it's a really sort of strange way of making limestone that's got nothing to do with the ocean. So geologic process rather than having been part of the seabed. So it's quite uniform across the terrace. The level that the chalk starts at varies between 0.5 metre down and about 1 metre. Where this wine's from kicks off, yeah, almost 1 metre down, about 80 centimetres down. So I guess the wine's notable in that it's off our vineyard, but it's not made by me. So this is a collaboration with Francois Millet. And so I was lucky to work with Francois at his former day job at De Vogüé in Chambon-Musigny in 2009. And we got on quite well. And his son came and did vintage with us in 2013 and stayed on and did the following vintage at Felton Road in 2014. And Francois and Michelle came out a couple of times over that period to New Zealand. And basically he really liked the wines. He loved Central Otago. And he was being quite complimentary about some of our barrels when we were tasting in the cellar. So I cheekily suggested if he liked it so much, he should come and make some. And to my surprise, he said that, yep, that would be really interesting. So it took a couple of years to put together. So I basically wanted everything to be his way. Otherwise, what's the point in having a sort of collaborational guest project? So we made sure we had the same gear as him for the traditional cask-to-cask racking with the hand pump out the head of the barrel. I hand bottled each parcel of the home vineyard. It's only 7 hectares separately, so he could choose which parcel he wanted. He'd walked the site, and so it's always the same block. It's just one tank with 12 barrels, and everything's done his way. So nothing happens to that wine without his direct instruction. If he's not in country, because I've worked with him in France and now in New Zealand for ages, he knows it'll be done the same way. So my role in it is just to try and deliver as precisely as possible his vision for the wine, and just, you know, take ourselves out of it as much as possible. And really fun for me, he's made every wine off that site to see someone else's interpretation of it. So a bit like a guest chef. And that was the very first vintage. So, you know, a harvest period that sort of snuck up quickly with those warm late temperatures. And Francois essentially just looked at the ferment very closely all the way through. He's very precise in terms of extraction and his approach. I guess he's noted over his period at de Vogüé, where he just retired from last year, and the wines he's making with his family now, as having an approach that is very transparent to the site. So you won't see whole bunch, you won't see much in the way of extraction. He only hand punched that wine once for the whole of fermentation. He just tasted it all the way through and thought that was enough. And then, yeah, no sulfur processing, and yeah, racked cask to cask after mellow, and basically handled pretty gently. And so that was his first go, and he seems to have just stayed quite consistent there in terms of extraction, and is still very much making it the same way. And I guess what was fun for us, and I think also for the region, is to have someone of Francois' caliber. You know, he's made 35 vintages at de Vogüé. He's got nothing to gain by doing some project in the New World. Coming in and, you know, actually putting his name on a bottle and making something in Central was really cool. And what's really nice is how highly he values the region and how much he likes the wines he's making here. You know, he's put them in blind tastings back in Burgundy and things like that. So that's a really cool sort of mark of respect for Central.
Yeah, I think that is one of it's just a beautiful story within our region. Our relationship with Burgundy started off and still is happening with the Burgundy exchange program. So we're young Central Otago winemakers, assistant winemakers, go across to do vintage in Burgundy and get a sense of philosophy and history. Then in return, the young Burgundians coming back to New Zealand to do harvest and realizing that there is a lot of freedom, except mum is not there anymore to wash the dishes and feed them. But again, that's part of the learning curve, because they really believe they stay at home until they get married and then they leave. Anyway, besides the point. So that's and I think Francois Millet, I mean, I met him the first time in '94, and a really extraordinarily nice wine. And the biggest thing I learned from him is when he talks about winemaking, and when it comes down to make a decision on the pressing, when you separate, you know, the wine from the skins, he said just always try to stay underneath the line. And I guess that's, or maybe get you to explain it what it means. I don't know. Does it make sense for you when we speak something, that kind of words underneath the line? You know what that means?
I think the Francois' approach is very much sort of flipping what can be quite a normal New World dynamic on its head a little bit, where he'll approach every decision with what does this vineyard need, not what do I want to do to it. And so he talks about that as this sort of exercise in empathy, and that there's this sort of empathetic line, if you like. If you go over it, then you're being aggressive and you're taking the wine and the winemaking away from the land. And if you don't get close enough to that sort of perfect line of empathy, then you're not expressing the wines to their true potential. And so, you know, he's always conscious of, that what does the site need, not do I want to do to it. And so that was really inspiring, seeing that over in Burgundy with the wines he's making at de Vogüé, just these micro differences in winemaking, whether it's between the Bon Mar and the Musigny, for example, and in both cases, just bringing out the very best in them.
Right now, me again, it's 11:30. Well, she's gone past it. So I'd better just quickly ask, does anyone have anything kind of burning question that you thought sitting there thinking, oh, if only I'd asked that?
You did such a good job.
Yeah, no, overwhelmed. I wish I could write it all down. So no one, everyone feel quite cheery. Everyone's smiling because I think they've all got to go to work and do all the millions of things. So listen, both of you, thank you so much. It was so perfect having you here. It's much lovelier than.
Oh, no.
Thanking you, and please come and see us whenever you're ready.
No, absolutely,
Don't be shy.
absolutely. No, I will. Well, unfortunately, Air New Zealand are skinning us alive at the cost of flight. So I can pay $750. I'm telling everyone to go to Blenheim. Then I'm feeling, feeling woeful after that. Anyway, but look, thank you so much for sharing your wines and your knowledge and being so generous. So
See you guys. Thank you.
can you see us all waving?
Thanks so much.
Bye. Oh, sweet.
Take care, and make sure you form your opinions on all those wines and tell Jane so we can get some feedback.
Yes.
We need some tasting notes.
See you later.
Bye.
Thanks.